I'm Laurie Forner, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to another episode of the Physical Performance Show. I trust you've been having a great week and I hope you've been enjoying pursuing your physical best. Today's episode, as always, is lovingly brought to you by POGO Physio and Normatec Recovery. Get fresh legs faster. On today's episode, we are back with an expert edition. And today's expert edition is all around women's health. I'd like to introduce you to M. George. M. George is a physio who is passionate about all things women's health. And I've had the pleasure of working alongside M. George for what's on 8 years now here at Pogo Physio. And I know today you're going to take a whole lot out of this conversation that Emily recently had with one of Australia's preeminent women's health physiotherapists. So, Em, great to have you on the Physical Performance Show today.
Hey, Brad, and thanks so much for having me. Guys, I am so excited for you to hear this conversation today. We featured Laurie Forner, who is an amazing physiotherapist up in Brisbane. Don't worry, all her details will be in the show notes, and we talk all things women's health and physical performance. This podcast is great for women, and it's great for coaches, it's great for boyfriends. Pretty much all you guys need to listen to this. We talk about running and pelvic floor. We talk about ab separation. We talk about exercise during pregnancy and how to get back to exercise after pregnancy and giving birth. There is a lot of information about there, but what we talk about today is based on the facts, and I'm just so excited for you to get this info.
So, Em, should we jump in?
Yes. Laurie, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have been so excited about this podcast all week, mainly because I know so many females listen to this show and have so many questions about pelvic floor. So when Brad said to me, Emily, I want to do a podcast about women's health and pelvic floor, who would be the best person to talk to? I said, let's get Laurie on here because you have worked in the area for a long time and you're active in the area. You see clients, you're also studying. I just knew straight away that you would be the best person to talk to. So thank you so much.
Oh, that's so flattering. Thank you. But yeah, I just feel like there's a lot of us out there that are doing this. And when you say I've been doing it for a long time, again, I still feel like there's so many people that have been doing it longer than me. So yes, it's been a little while.
Before we kind of jump into the content, do you just want to give us a little bit of a background of how you came into the area of pelvic floor and what your day-to-day kind of looks like?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad in Canada in human movements. So, it's not called human movements there, but whatever I think it's human movements here in Australia. And I worked as an exercise physiologist with some physios, and my boss at the time was doing some women's health stuff, which I thought was pretty disgusting because there was just a trolley with gloves and lube. And I'm like, what are you doing? Do physios actually do that? Then I came to Australia and did my master's in physiotherapy. It was a graduate entry master's at the University of Queensland. And we went back to Canada. I worked as a physiotherapist in private practices with musculoskeletal clients, with sports clients. Started teaching Pilates as well. Came back to Australia, kept working as a physio, teaching Pilates. And someone had asked me to start teaching pregnancy Pilates. And I thought, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing. And a week later found out I was pregnant.
Wow.
As you do. I know. It's like the universe knew. But I'm the type of person that when I start looking into things, I like to know the reasons why and the details. And so with Pilates and pregnancy, there was nothing out there. And people would say, you shouldn't do this or you should do this. Well, there wasn't any information. So I just kept reading more and more and thought, this is a really cool area. And that's kind of how I then ventured down into all of the gynecology side. And then so now I work private practice. So I've got my own little practice set up out of 2 businesses that I treat out of part-time. And within all of this, I've had 2 kids. And I love it so much and think it's really exciting that I started doing research this year at the University of Queensland. Yes. So so I'm working part-time and studying some pelvic floor things.
Just so all our listeners out there know, everything that we do in physiotherapy is really research-based. We won't do things unless there's evidence behind it. So the fact that Laurie is out there studying and getting more information so we can serve you all better, I just think that's so exciting.
Well, it's hard when like I said, I need to know the details and the reasons why. And the more we try to, advise women on what they should and shouldn't do during pregnancy, but especially after pregnancy, you realize that there's no research or information telling us why we're telling people that. And when you look into it further, you're like, well, maybe it's not that bad. Well, maybe you can do this. So that's where I noticed this big gap, particularly with heavy lifting. And so we're looking at a certain pelvic floor dysfunction in women who do heavy lifting and the use of certain products, which I think we'll talk about later. And how those things can help, because there's not enough information out there. So even the questions that that we're going to talk about today, it's hard because a lot of the answers are, it depends.
Mm-hmm, definitely. A lot of people have heard the term pelvic floor, and a lot of women know that we have pelvic floor muscles. But I want you to pretend that you're sitting there with one of your clients. I know it can be hard, not drawing and using the visual side, but how would you explain the pelvic floor to one of your clients?
Yes, I'm a very visual learner, so I do a lot of pictures and I draw a lot of things. And so even now, trying to explain this through podcast, I'll be talking with my hands, and I know nobody can see. But generally, at the base of our pelvis, there's a few openings. So for women, there's 3 openings. There's the urethra, the vagina, and the anus. And the pelvic floor muscles help to kind of provide sphincters around those areas. And there's a couple different layers. So there's a few layers that help to squeeze the openings closed. And there's a layer composed of a whole bunch of muscles that also helps to lift things. So the pelvic floor muscles sit right at the bottom, but they're not the only things that are in the pelvis supporting our organs. So you've got your bladder, you've got your vagina and your uterus, you've got your rectum. So your pelvic floor muscles are pretty much right at the bottom, and those organs are sitting on top, but they're not just flopped and laying on top. There's all these elastic bands, which is your connective tissue or your fascia inside, that are also kind of like slings holding those organs up as well. And I think they may not be spoken enough. They're not talked enough about, that when people have issues, they go straight to pelvic floor muscles, but the connective tissue is pretty important.
And I think when people are pregnant, they think, I need to do my pelvic floor exercises, or after they've given birth, they go, I have a weak pelvic floor, I have weak pelvic floor muscles. But what they don't understand is that through pregnancy and childbirth, a lot of changes happen to the connective tissue. So you could have the strongest pelvic floor muscles in the world, but if those connective tissues and ligaments have been affected, you could do a million pelvic floor exercises. That's not necessarily going to help you.
Yeah, it's got to be the combination of the two of them working together. And as physios working in this field, we look at both, but That's what, gynecologists, when they do surgery, they're fixing the connective tissue. They're not changing the muscles. And when we work on the muscles, whether people need to contract or relax them, it affects the connective tissue, but it's not, directly tightening and lifting everything to where it needs to be sometimes.
So during pregnancy, what changes do happen to the pelvic floor?
So it's a hard area to study because pregnant women ethically, there's not a lot that, we can do to them to have a look at. So slowly they're using more and more things like ultrasound to try to work out exactly what's happening in pregnancy and labor and childbirth. But basically, our whole, the system especially within our pelvis and our abdomen, everything's getting a little bit stretched out in order to allow for a baby to come out of the vagina where it's generally meant to come out of. All the tissues, the connective tissue, the muscles, everything needs to soften and stretch and open up a little bit. So pretty much from when you start to get pregnant, those changes start to happen. But especially in that third trimester is when everything is really starting to get a little bit soft and wider and more open so that it's easier to get the baby out. So other than the tissues in the pelvis getting soft and stretchy, the tummy muscles, which is, technically part of our core and can affect what's happening in your pelvic floor, they need to stretch in order to accommodate the size of the baby as it grows. So basically everything just gets bigger and wider and more open.
And what's your opinion on doing pelvic floor exercises through pregnancy? What would you generally recommend for some of your clients?
So this is where it depends on the person. And based on this generalization of people getting weak and stretched and lengthened is where the let's contract and tighten and strengthen pelvic floor comes in. But everyone's body responds differently to changes. So some people, their pelvic floor muscles do it it responds themselves. They know their body's changing, so the pelvic floor muscles might get a little bit more tone and work harder here and there, but also know to relax when it needs to. There's some people where their pelvic floor muscles may guard and protect too much. So even through their pregnancy, while their body's changing, everything's actually way too tense. So telling someone whose pelvic floor is too tense to contract all the time is probably not very helpful, especially if you want the baby to come out of there in your third trimester. But so people who are weak, or it's strength, or if it's lengthening, contracting and doing some strengthening exercises are good. But when people are listening to this, they're like, well, how do I know which one I am? So generally, I will teach people to do both. So if you're going to work on your pelvic floor, then it's thinking of holding on to wee and wind. There's a squeeze and there's a lift inside, but there's also that letting go and that relaxing. So sometimes we'll teach people to squeeze and hold for, as strong as they can, but then breathe. And most people go, well, that's really awkward. I can't breathe when I try to do that. Because in real life, the only time where the body does that is if you cough or sneeze or laugh or lift something heavy, and it's only a few seconds and you're usually not breathing. But the pelvic floor muscles are in such an awkward spot that we have to come up with interesting ways to challenge them and train them. So throughout pregnancy, again, unless I have physically examined someone or if they're having issues, then I will say you can do your pelvic floor exercises, do some squeezing, some holding, some breathing, say 5 or 10 seconds, do some relaxing, and doing it here and doing it kind of sporadically throughout the day.
Because I would find a lot of women really beat themselves up about that kind of thing. They say, I was so busy working, or I was just so exhausted by the end of my pregnancy. I did no pelvic floor exercises and now I'm leaking, or now I can't run without leaking, or I get this heavy feeling. And I just think not doing your exercises just for such a short period, that's not going to cause these problems down the track? No. We more or less, I think in pregnancy too, it's more just trying to keep that brain-body connection. So that if you think of, and it's a body part that a lot of people are disconnected from, because it's not like we look at it every day and touch it and show everyone. So our brain's kind of like, I don't know where it is. Yeah. So if you're doing some squeezing and relaxing, your brain's like, oh, I know where that muscle is. So that if it does happen to get stretched and go through a little bit of, trauma, that's natural, then you can find it quicker.
So your brain can get back into that rehab part a lot faster if it knew where it was before. Does that make sense?
Definitely. I think that's really great words of advice. So pretty much, ladies out there, don't beat yourself up if you forget to do your pelvic floor exercises a couple of days here and there. But if you can try and think about it and have that connection, that's going to set you up for a win in the postnatal time.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And so speaking of pregnancy and during pregnancy, would you have any kind of guidelines for women who like to run, how to know whether to continue running through their pregnancy or if they should kind of take it down a notch and maybe cycle or walk or something different? I know this is a really tricky question, Laurie, but because I think sometimes women think they should just stop completely and some people might push a bit too far. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Again, it's one of those, it depends, but it's more based on personality type as well. That like if you take an elite athlete who is used to competing and they're going to go back to competing afterwards, there's probably no way in hell that you're going to convince them that they should stop. And when you look at the research, and there was some, there was these consensus statements done by a lot of medical professionals and physiotherapists last year and this year, talking about recreational and elite level athletes, just saying that, the main exercises to avoid are the ones that they can do harm to you and the baby. So, collisions or ice hockey or scuba diving or things like that. So running gets a little bit tricky because it's coming down to, can your body adapt or compensate for the impact that you're causing it? Now, a lot of women will be okay and they'll continue running through their whole pregnancy and their pelvic floor is fine and they feel fine. Whereas a lot of women will continue running through their pregnancy and say once because everyone will carry differently, and think too, this is different when you're having your first baby compared to your second, third, or fourth, when your body's already stretched and changed. So once your belly starts to fill and you feel the weight of the baby through the tummy sometimes will cause people, say, end of second trimester to stop running. But if your body's not compensating, so depending on your connective tissue, which comes down to hormones, but also genetics, some people's genetics just have stretchier connective tissue. Yeah. So if they're running with a heavier weight inside their pelvis and they've got that impact, then they might start to feel heaviness or they might start to leak, or it just doesn't feel right. So they will tend to stop a little bit earlier. So advice-wise, I will take it person by person. So I still get people to try to consider, if you are going for a run in your second trimester, and depending on your size, and gait efficiency and running efficiency comes into play. If you've got someone with a really good, great running style, then they're going to generate less ground reaction forces and they tend to feel better and can run longer, as opposed to someone who's got a really big stride length and they're a little bit of a heavier runner. They might have to stop a little bit earlier. So it's usually discussing with a health professional that works in this area based on your circumstance, whether or not you should keep running through your, again, end of second, third trimester, I'd say is mainly the time that you'd want to be working out if that's something you should keep doing.
And I think something women really need to keep in mind is that your pregnancy and your running friend's pregnancy are very different. Just because your friend ran until 8 months doesn't mean that you can or that you need to. And I know so many people run because they love it, it, but you need to listen to your body. You know your body better than anyone else. So you need to listen to it and see what's happening when you're doing it and take all these things into account and don't care about anybody else.
Yeah, and the tricky thing with the listening to your body is, again, that personality type. If they are a competitive athlete, they are really good at ignoring things in their body and just pushing through it. So that's kind of not the time to do that. It's, you have to be a little bit more aware and sensitive about what your body might be telling you.
You're listening to Laurie Forner, women's health specialist and Laurie's conversation with Emily George, Women's Health Physio at POGO Physio. Support for today's show comes from Normatec Recovery. Normatec is the leader in rapid recovery systems designed to give a competitive edge to the world's elite endurance athletes. The Normatec Pulse recovery systems are dynamic compression devices designed for recovery and rehab, using its patented pulse technology to help athletes recover faster between workouts and after performance by reducing muscle soreness and improving circulation. Get fresh legs faster with Normatec. Jump over to alphasport.com.au for all details about the terrific Normatec recovery range. Support for today's episode also comes, as always, lovingly from POGO Physio. We exist to help you perform at your physical best. We want everyone who walks through the doors of POGO Physio to cross their physio finish line. That's where we high-five you, tell you that we love you. You don't need to come back. You're back to your physical best, doing the things that you love. We do this through session-to-session care, as well as some industry-first models of care, including our unique 2, 6 and 12-week fixed-fee, unlimited access finish line programs. Also, recently, our Wellness Booster packages, which give people through the door at POGO access to a whole host of services for very low monthly fees. And of course, if today's episode resonates with you and you need or feel you'd benefit from some women's health physio services, be sure to jump over to pogophysio.com.au and schedule your initial appointment from there. Now, let's jump back to Laurie Forner and Emily George on all things women's health.
As a physio, I'm always thinking when it comes to exercise, risk versus benefit. So is the benefit of the running worth the risk to your pelvic floor and to your ligaments and other joints? So I think that's something when you're pregnant and postnatal and participating in exercise, always think, is the risk to my pelvic floor worth this 30-minute sprint? Or maybe not today. Yeah. Speaking of pregnancy, so we've spoken about pelvic floor. Let's talk about abdominal separation. So I had a question, or actually first, let's talk about what is abdominal separation. Do you want to go through that?
Yeah, we could spend a couple hours on this one. Again, it's one of those topics where we just don't have a lot of information. If you look down at your tummy, there's a space between kind of your abdominal muscles. Like there's a line running from the top of your rib cage all the way down to your pubic bone, that if you were to contract your tummy muscles, you can see this kind of space. Or if you look at, like a Men's Health magazine, there's that nice line down the center. And women have that line too. But that's composed of connective tissue, so that as the baby's growing, that area softens so that your belly can expand. So your belly doesn't just expand outwards, it also outwards in front, it also expands outwards to the side. So there is a natural, normal amount of that space getting bigger and opening. And I think within the literature, 100% of women in their third trimester are going to have a bigger space. So people used to get really worked up or worried about how big the space is getting during their pregnancy, but it's normal and it's natural and it has to happen. Once the baby comes out, generally by 8 weeks, all of those tissues have kind of creeped back towards each other and they get a little bit tighter and stronger. Some people are left with a little bit more of a gap. So we measure it, say, at the belly button or just above with our fingers, horizontally side to side, so that if somebody is lying on their back and they kind of come up, we can look and have a feel of a gap or a space. And when they lie back down and they relax, their muscles kind of relax outwards a little bit more. And we measure how far apart the two sides of the muscles are. So that's what the abdominal separation is. Now, with research and as time goes on, how big that gap isn't our main focus as much anymore. It's about, you've got all these other layers of connective tissue and muscle underneath. How well can your body compensate for the size of the gap? So some women, technically normal is like 2 fingers. But I've seen people who I can fit 5 fingers in between their abdominal muscles, but it's nice and solid underneath. And when they do things, it doesn't cause like a Toblerone or a pointing or a really odd shape in their belly. They can control it well. And I've seen women who only have 2 centimeters, but when they do something like, even just standing, pulling a band down with your arms, or sit-ups, all their abdominal contents kind of poke through and you can see this little pointy tummy. So it's more about kind of how the body reacts to that underneath.
And would you say that activities you participate in during your pregnancy can affect that space? This is very hard because it's not really in the literature, but maybe we can talk a bit about your experience.
Personally or professionally?
Professional.
It's tricky to know if there's any specific exercises that cause that to happen. Generally, if someone's pregnant, they got a nice round belly. And if they're leaning back on their chair and they go to get up and the belly causes this strange looking point instead of staying nice and round, their body is just not dealing with that change in pressure very well. So they're kind of overusing some muscles, or they're not kind of controlling it somewhere. So if activities cause that to happen and you continue to do them and push through that, then you're probably going to continue straining, and your body's, that's probably not going to go away as easily, or it can worsen over time. So things that really stress your abdominals. So planks, because your belly is kind of hanging down with gravity and you're having to use your tummy muscles, sometimes that's hard to control and might make things have more strain through them. Abdominal sit-ups, which the bigger your belly gets, I don't know what you need to get into that position for anyway, in order to do kind of curl ups. So that's a good way to see if that's happening. And even things like, if you're standing and you've got those resistance bands and you're pulling them down and doing kind of lat pull downs, something that's making your tummy muscles work, and you see that doming happening. If you keep pushing through that type of activity, then you might just be, again, straining your abdominal muscles and not controlling the extra pressure. Does that answer your question?
That answers it really well. The reason I asked was because I had a question from the audience. The person asking, she participates in yoga and is quite an active person. She's just heading into her she's in her second trimester, and was wondering when she should start avoiding exercises that use her abs. Like, at what point do you stop using your abs? But you
use your abs for every exercise.
Just stabilizing yourself, getting out of the chair, your abs are going to activate to help support you. So I think you've answered that really well, Laurie. So ladies, if you're doing exercises and you notice that doming, stop.
Yeah, the exercise is either too hard, or you might have held your breath. And sometimes by controlling your breath through certain activities, that might change the pressure and you can control it better. Or sometimes things like certain abdominal exercises or pelvic floor exercises might help with some of that control. So it's usually seeing a physio to go through some of that stuff.
Yeah. Especially if you love yoga or you love a certain sport and you want to keep doing it, let us help you keep doing it properly.
Yeah, I think with yoga, the main one that comes to mind is back bends, because it's like a full gymnastic back bend. If you're not just using the abdominals, your abdominals are still on to control you in that position, but they're really stretched. Plus there's a baby in there, so they're even more stretched, that it could be a position that compromises. But it's person dependent. If someone's been doing yoga forever, they've been doing that all through first trimester, and they feel comfortable doing it, it may not necessarily be bad. I've seen people do it as long as they're comfortable the whole time, and they don't have a diastasis afterwards. I think clinically, I see more, and again, it can just be the people that come through my door. So it's not necessarily this is what happens, but people who have cesarean sections. So if people have a pregnancy and a natural vaginal birth, the tissue in between their tummy muscles stretches, and then it has to start to knit back together. Whereas a cesarean, they have to open it up. Like they have to physically separate the tissue to get to the uterus. And so it's a little trickier for people who've had cesareans sometimes for that to naturally come back. Or I find that more people who've had cesareans have more issues with a space or a gap after having babies.
And so we've spoken about the pregnancy side of things now. Let's talk about managing abdominal separation after you've given birth. So let's start like right from the start. So day one after you've given birth, what are some recommendations you'd give to women to help manage their abdominal separation?
So again, everyone will have one. In hospital, a lot of the physios will come check and they'll be like, you have 10 centimeters. And that number sometimes is so scary. In some hospitals, they will give people some compression pants, which if you think you use your tummy muscles for everything, which means getting out of the bed to feed the baby, to go to the toilet, the 100 things that you need to do, sometimes the compression is just putting your abdominal muscles that are in hospital super floppy, so not working as well. They just might put them in a bit of a better position so that you can use them a bit more efficiently. Usually in hospital, whether you've had a cesarean or a vaginal birth, they'll teach you how to get out of bed. So rather than lying on your back and flinging yourself up, it's rolling to the side and then kind of pushing yourself up. Same thing with when you have to pick the baby up or put the baby down, then we might teach people to try to keep their back straight and stick their butt out to bend, because if you're bending forwards, it's allowing the tummy to sag and you're not using it as well. But also when you're standing holding babies, the way that you stand, once as you get pregnant and your belly gets bigger, you kind of end up pushing your hips forwards and holding your belly with your back pretty much. And once the baby comes out, your body doesn't automatically go, oh, I should be straight. And so and the baby has no head control. So you kind of still end up putting your belly forwards and your shoulders back to hold the weight of the baby. And sometimes that position can put a bit of a strain through the tummy. So we just try to get people, as straight as possible.
Yeah.
So that would be in hospital as well as when you start to come out.
Would you find that the recommendations you give to people to help their abdominal separation are similar to the recommendations you give to help reduce pressure on the pelvic floor?
Yes. So again, there isn't really any research saying that posture or positions influence how well your tummy muscles and your pelvic floor muscles are working or kind of change in posture. So we don't want people to be afraid of getting into certain positions. It's just spending too long in positions that might strain your tummy muscles. When your tummy muscles have to work, your core, the center of your body is like a balloon. So when they're working and your diaphragm's on top and then your pelvic floor muscles are on the bottom, if your tummy is working, it's like you're squeezing the middle of a balloon. So there's pressure changing inside. Your diaphragm's, on top. So if you imagine kind of pushing on the top of a balloon and then squeezing the sides, all of that pressure can go downwards. So how your tummy muscles are working sometimes will influence whether your pelvic floor muscles have a stretch put on them or they work and go, oh, she's causing too much pressure, I better turn on and work. So what you're doing with your tummy can influence pelvic floor from kind of a pressure standpoint.
And when a woman comes and sees you 6 weeks after birth, because generally that's when people come and see you and they're really stressed out about their abdominal separation, sometimes women ask, how long will it take for this to come back together? And I know it kind of varies case by case as well, but what kind of loving general advice would you give our women out there who are freaking out about abdominal separation?
So most of the tissue, and this is kind of without a Caesar, so most of the tissues on their own by 8 weeks are generally as good as they're going to get without having done any other intervention. So without somebody looking at trying to strengthen their tummy muscles or bring pelvic floor in or watch their posture. So just tissue standpoint, by about 8 weeks it's all kind of melded back together. But like I said, we over time you can influence what you're doing with abdominal muscles. So how you're bringing them into certain exercises. And when your tummy muscles start to get stronger over time, that can influence it. Now, hormones and with breastfeeding can also keep things a little bit softer. So if someone's breastfeeding for 1 or 2 years, then it's not that nothing's going to change in 1 or 2 years, but sometimes there's still that little bit of softness, and they might still get a little bit of bulging when they do certain things up to 1 or 2 years. When someone's had a cesarean section, the healing times are just a little bit longer. So sometimes it takes about, I said 8 weeks for things to be knitted back together. With a cesarean, it might be, say, 6 or 7 months before that scar tissue is a little bit more solid in through the center. So if somebody comes in and they're really worried, a big part is trying to educate them that, part of it's normal, and that a big part is just learning how to control that pressure inside by maybe moving certain ways or bringing in certain tummy muscles or pelvic floor muscles, and working out what kind of activity that they want to get back to. Because, something, say, like running, you're upright, you're using your abdominals, but it's not generally stressing them to the point where we have to have a discussion about whether or not you can get back to that activity from an abdominal standpoint. Whereas if somebody wants to get back to, sit-ups backwards over a ball, it might take them a little bit longer to get back to that if they're not able to control it. So from an early point, we might do little exercises like lying on your back, learning how to engage tummy muscles, pelvic floor, learning how to coordinate and breathe, lifting a leg, lifting the other leg on your hands and knees. So there's other little exercises that we can do early on, which sometimes just having a management pathway, somebody telling you, okay, this is normal, this should happen over time, let's do these exercises, just can make people feel better as well.
And I think in the media, so many celebrities and things are showing their bikini bodies 3 weeks after they give birth or something, and it can give women these unrealistic expectations, or they just put a lot of pressure on themselves. So I think that comment has been so helpful. Like, 8 weeks, guys, like, give your body some time. You were just pregnant for 9 months. You've just birthed a gorgeous baby.
The tricky thing too with an abdominal separation is we're looking, when we assess people, you're lying down on your back. But when you stand up, you now have all of your abdominal contents, which you can't get rid of, now kind of hanging in that abdominal space. And when you have a separation, those tummy muscles are a little bit wider. But when you stand up against gravity and the organs sit in them, it kind of makes it even more wide. And you're not meant to walk around all day squeezing your tummy muscles. So when you're relaxed and you have a separation and you're upright, you then usually have a bit more of a tummy hanging out forwards, which is, I find, what concerns people more than anything. They might be able to control it really, really well in all exercises. It doesn't give them pain. Skin tissue is another big thing. Like, if people get a lot of stretch marks, often that means your connective tissue inside is also extra stretchy. And if somebody stands up and their tummy muscles are okay, but they've got a lot of stretch marks and the skin's hanging, we can't change the skin. The only thing that can help with the extra skin is surgery. And at some point down the road, sometimes it bugs people enough psychologically that it warrants having it done. It's okay. But the tummy muscles themselves, if their skin is okay and they stand up, sometimes, again, they're really strong, but it's just that their tummy hangs out a bit when they're standing, and it never used to before. And again, they can go through all the exercises and be really strong and control it really well. And the only time they notice it and it bugs them is when they're standing relaxed. And so sometimes that comes down to time and being comfortable with a different body shape than what you had before. Or again, which can take years when you do get back to, higher intense exercises or more abdominal work, things like that can change.
Postnatally, when women do want to return to exercise, what are some things that they should be looking out for when they're getting back to running or boot camps or CrossFit? What should they look for?
The first 6 weeks is, it's not that you ignore everything, it's just that there is so much changes happening that if you are having certain problems, try not to freak out too much about them, because often by 6 weeks, those problems that we'll talk about in a second will resolve themselves and go away. But things like leaking urine or wee, so at any point, but especially during exercise, if you cough or sneeze or laugh or get up out of a chair, some sort of positional change, something that causes extra pressure that causes you to leak some urine, that's a sign that something's not working right. The feeling of pressure or heaviness or a lump or a bulge somewhere in the vagina, sometimes people will feel like it's looser down there. It can be difficult to empty your bladder. So you go to pee and you can't pee, or you finish peeing and then you get up and then you leak a little bit there, or you don't feel empty, so having to then sit back down and empty again. And same thing with the bowels, which is a big one after having a baby, is how your bowels are working and not straining and trying not to push and not getting constipated, which can all happen after having a baby. But also things like when women return to intercourse, is making sure that it's not painful. So the first time can be awkward and uncomfortable, and people can use like a bottle of lubrication for the first time they try having sex again after having a baby. But if the second or third time you try to have sex and it's still really painful, that's not normal. You've got to work out kind of what's going on. Because like I said at the beginning, people have a baby that comes out of muscles and connective tissue that have to stretch to the point where other muscles in our body, if they stretch that much, they would tear. And most of the time, women don't. So the muscles are designed to do that. It doesn't mean that everyone after they have a baby, the muscles are hanging in the wind and they're loose. Some women, their body has that extra guarding protective mechanism, and it tightens up even more to protect what's just happened. And then they have too much tension, and that's kind of along the lines where people may have some pain with intercourse as well.
Yeah, I think so often we focus on weak pelvic floor and things like that. People don't really realize it can go the opposite way. It can be too tight as well. Yeah,
which can increase sensitization. So if someone, say, is getting back into running or exercise, and after they exercise, it just feels a bit sore down there, heavy. It can be a prolapse where, say, your bladder, your uterus, or your rectum starting to descend downwards towards the opening. But sometimes it's because their pelvic floor muscles have overworked and have fatigued, and now they're sore themselves. So those are generally the symptoms we try to get people to look out for, is kind of a bulge or heaviness, pain, or leaking. But also when I say leaking, I talked about leaking wee, but leaking stool. So leaking kind of poo out your backside when you don't want to is not good. But also gas. A lot of people will talk about the inability to control, holding in a fart, or they sneak out and they can't keep it in. Yeah.
So many women have these symptoms, and these symptoms are common, and people think because their friends are experiencing these symptoms that it's okay. But something that physios we often talk about is just because something is common does not mean it is normal. It does not mean that you have to live with it. It doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. So that's what I really wanted to get across with what Laurie is saying. You guys need to look out for these things, because if you're having these symptoms, you can most possibly do something about it.
Yeah. And look, there was research last year that came out, finally, anal incontinence, which is also fecal incontinence, which is losing, poo out your bottom when you don't want it to happen. They've looked at the prevalence of female athletes, even recreational athletes, especially runners, and it was 80 to 85% of women have had that happening. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's just a pelvic floor problem. The consistency of your poo inside is really important too. If it's watery and diarrhea, nobody is going to be able to hold it in. But over time, there's a little bit more of not a focus, but people are starting to talk about that a little bit more, because, it's hard enough for people to admit that they may have a problem with leaking wee. It's even harder to talk about the backside.
You're listening to M. George and Laurie Forner share around all things women's health. If you missed last week's episode featuring Curtis McGrath, OAM, Paralympic gold medalist, 6 times world champion, Curtis was described by the Australian newspaper as arguably Australia's most inspiring world champion. Last week's episode's been remarkably popular, and there's little wonder why. It was a longer featured conversation, but one that just couldn't be cut short. If you missed it, jump back. You'll hear Curtis take us through the journey of losing his legs at the age of 24, tragically, in a bomb blast in Afghanistan, right through to winning that precious Paralympic gold medal just several years later. And of course, the highs and lows and the many learnings in his journey to date. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au or simply peruse your favourite podcast player. Now let's jump back to M. George and Laurie Forner on all things women's health.
So, when it comes to running, what kind of guidelines do you give to women for returning to running after a baby? So not so much like timelines as such, but it's like if you can do X, then you can progress to doing Y. You know, like what kind of, if you just, for example, had a runner in your clinic, what kind of things would let her do more running?
Okay. So generally, if people have problems or leaking or dysfunction walking, then running's probably not going to work very well. There's certain outcome measures that we use in the clinic in order that kind of gives us numbers. And when it comes down to running, because you're not meant to run squeezing your pelvic floor muscles. Your pelvic floor muscles are supposed to, it's kind of like jumping off a box with your legs straight. Ow, that hurts. Your knees bend to absorb that shock. Your pelvic floor muscles kind of do the same thing as you run. There's this little bounce with them. So you're not supposed to run holding them tight. You rely on kind of more of the resting tone. So we will use this piece of equipment to assess what someone's resting tone is like. So often I will have people coming in for other problems and running is a goal. So I'm already looking at these numbers and values so I can say, look, this is where you're at. I'd like you to be here before you start to try to run. Or people will come in and go, I went for a run and this happened. And then we'll have a look at things and kind of guide them that way. So it's hard kind of without looking at people to say, this is where you should start and kind of follow the pathway. But if you've got to look at your body like, you know, even if you've run through your pregnancy and then you've had a Caesar, there's still a period of time where you haven't ran and your body is changing and trying to heal. So there's going to be a period of time where you're not going to be running. So when you try to get back into running, it's got to be like, ooh, pretend you haven't ran in 6 months or you're coming back from an injury. It's something that's going to happen that's slow. So I will get people to go for a walk and then try a minute run. And then, 5-minute walk, 1-minute run, kind of like the couch to 5Ks. Yeah, like a walk run program. And in the first time that they try running, no more than 5 to 10 minutes and see how they feel. But again, that's me then having looked at how's their bladder support, what's their pelvic floor muscles like, so that I can tell them, look, because we know that once women have had babies, that support to the bladder is like 50% stretchier, even without having any leaking or problems. It's just what happens to the body. It gets a bit stretchier. It doesn't always go back to as tight as it was before. So if people keep pushing through that, is that then over time going to make them have more problems? We don't know. So if people come into my clinic and they have a bladder that's got extra movement in it, then I will get them to use these things called a pessary. So we fit them, that's like a little silicone device that has lots of different shapes and sizes that goes inside the vagina like a tampon. And it gives their bladder a little bit of support. And then they can start trying to get back in to the running. But if they're going too fast in return, like not speed-wise, but if returning too quickly, at least they've got that added support. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Would you say that you use pessaries for like a short period of time. So when they're starting to get back into running, you'll use the pessary to help support the bladder. And as their hormones change and they get stronger, you try to wean off the pessary? Or is it something that they'll use continuously?
So, yeah, it depends. It depends on the person. So some people, they'll use it for a period of time. They find it really helpful, and say 3 to 6 months later, I'll say try running without it and see how you feel, depending on what we find in the assessment without it in. And if they feel okay and they're not having any problems and I don't see anything that's, abnormal, then they might just keep running without it. Sometimes, again, there's a really big jump between running and skipping. I find skipping tends to that 2-foot impact. People may be fine with running, but it's when they start skipping they have problems, and they only have problems during skipping. Then we might use the pessary just when they do skipping.
Great. So that would be particularly in the CrossFit population, because they have a lot of WODs with double unders and things like that.
Yeah, then when you bring double unders in, the height of your jump is even higher and the ground reaction force. Yeah, it's a whole other ball game with skipping.
Yeah, definitely. I just have a question from the audience, Laurie. So I'll just talk a little bit about her history and then go through that. So this lady is currently 8 weeks post-pregnancy, and she had twins. Okay, so they were her second and third children, and she's a runner. But she does like marathons and 50K trail races type things. So this lady ran until she was 4 months pregnant, and then she just continued to do like intervals on her bike and walked about 5 to 7 Ks per day. So just keeping in mind, everyone, this lady had twins. At the 6-week mark, she got the all clear to return to running. But I have a feeling this was from...
How did she have them? Did she have them cesarean or natural?
I don't actually have that detail.
Oh, that's tricky.
Because it makes a big difference. But then she was cleared to return to running, but I'm not sure if this was by a physio or a doctor. I think it was from her obstetrician. And she feels like her pelvic floor needs a lot of work. So what she wanted to know was how long would her pelvic floor take to recover, and are there any tips for a speedy pelvic floor recovery?
Okay, so that's tricky because she's had one before. Like, she very well could have had a vaginal delivery and then a Caesar, because twins often, or they used to be kind of almost an automatic cesarean. However, in the last kind of 4 years, I think more people have been then going back to vaginal delivery to deliver twins. So that's why I'm like, ooh, I don't know which way she would have had the babies. And having a cesarean doesn't mean that, you're not necessarily you're in the clear for not having any pelvic floor issues. But the muscles are similar to other muscles in our bodies. So the first kind of 4 to 6 weeks of starting to do any kind of strength training for them is more your brain just working out what you're doing, what you're asking it to do, where are the muscles, how to coordinate it, how do I breathe. You don't really start to get kind of a thickness and strength in muscle for a good 3 to 6 months. So it's not that people don't see any changes within that time. It's just that the real changes happen. It takes a long time. It's like if you go to the gym to work your biceps, within that first month, you might start using more and more weights, but that little bump that, stays in your arm when you're not having to flex for people, that takes, that good kind of 3 to 6 months. So, but it can't be 3 to 6 months of doing the same exercise. Like any muscle, whatever strengthening program that you're doing has to continually be challenging and progressive, because if you do the same thing, your body's not going to change. And this is where there's controversy over, do you just squeeze and hold your pelvic floor muscles, say 5 to 10 seconds, rest, do 3 sets of 10, do it in a couple different positions like standing, sitting, on your hands and your knees, and just increase the time and the repetitions? Probably not, because it'll get really boring really quickly, and it may not carry over to running. So we have to come up with really creative ways to strengthen that muscle, because it's not like there are weights that you can put inside there that you can do some endurance type activities with, or there's even one that's 500 grams that you can it's almost like you're doing deadlifts with it that you squeeze and relax and then have to hold it from falling out. So there's there's little different ways that we can go about in order to create a strengthening program, but everyone you see is going to have a different idea and way of doing it. If someone's wanting to get back to running, then some pelvic floor training needs to be upright and standing, because you run in standing. You run landing on one leg, so we'll get people to balance on one leg but not dropping the hip, so a nice control, and doing some pelvic floor exercises in that position. We'll get people to, again, your body has to work out how to absorb that shock. So we get people to think about how they breathe and how they, like we were talking about earlier, the cadence, kind of that turnover with their feet, so that they've got the foot landing under the center of their gravity, which might be mid or forefoot and not heel. It depends on the person. So strengthening, like a strength program wise for her, would really depend on how those babies came out. And when we talk about all this pelvic floor muscle strength training and postpartum, there's a certain muscle in the body that gets stretched more than others and may not come back, ever, or as strong as the others, which means you've got 100% of muscle strength and now you only have 90%, and you can't get any stronger than that. I think the last stats were 15 to 40% of people will have this defect in this muscle. And, you don't really know that it's there unless somebody else is telling you that it's there. But that may then affect on how soon people can get back into certain sports and activities, or how, much more strength or resting tone they're able to get in their pelvic floor.
And what would you say about glute strength?
Glutes.
Yeah, like doing some glute exercises as well. Is that something that you would include in like your management strategies with runners?
Yeah, so remember I said everyone's going to come at pelvic floor exercises a different way, and it needs to be functional. It doesn't work on its own. So when you run, or when you are standing, or when you pick up a baby, it's never just your pelvic floor or your tummy muscles or your breathing. There's all these other muscles around your pelvis and in your whole body. They're meant to work in a coordinated fashion, and they're meant to work without us ever having to think about it. So even when we talk about pelvic floor exercises and tummy exercises, it's not that you have to do these exercises for the rest of your life for most people. Because again, like I say, you don't want to tell someone to squeeze their pelvic floor and then try to run holding it. It's not how it works. If you go back to a sport, especially, if you're playing hockey or basketball, you can't think about your pelvic floor. You're going to get hit in the face with a puck or a ball. So it's trying to make sure that you are working it for whatever activity that you have to do. But glutes and pelvic floor are generally best friends because, again, where the glutes are situated around the pelvis. Obviously, we don't want people to squeeze their glutes when they're trying to, say, isolate their pelvic floor. But the only time we're getting people to isolate their pelvic floor all on its own is A, to get their brain connected to it, and B, to do some type of strengthening for it if they're really, really weak and uncoordinated and they can't kind of put everything all together. So no, glute exercises are great, but there's so many of them out there.
Oh, that was such a great answer. I think that is going to help so many people. I think that's something people really need to do when they've had a baby and they're getting back to running is look out for those symptoms that Laurie mentioned. So you do a 5K run and you're fine, then you start building up, you do a 10K run and you notice some leaking or you notice some heaviness. It doesn't mean you've done irreversible damage to your pelvic floor and you need to can everything. It means you've just done a bit too much with that session. So you need to take it down a bit and slowly build back up again. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the only sad thing is that pelvic floor issues tend to be lowest priority on moms' schedules. So often they may have those symptoms and go, I'm going to do something about it, but it may take them a couple years to do something about it. So it's trying not to wait too long before you do something about it. And when you are trying to do, I would say my schedule may be full, and then within like a couple hours, people drop off quickly because the first thing they cancel, because when life gets crazy and hectic, it's the last thing they think about. So it's just just being aware that that is probably going to happen because it's life as a mum, but just having a plan and trying not to let that happen.
Is there like one last piece of advice that you'd like to give to our mums out there, whether they're pregnant or postnatal, just from your experience and being a mum yourself? If you had to give one piece of advice, what would you say?
I think it's just trying to find some physical activity that you love doing and working with someone to help you work out a way for you to continue doing it. Because it's enough for us to say, this exercise is bad, you can only swim, but you hate swimming. You will then do nothing, and then you may then become, too inactive, and then it probably changes the foods you're eating, and then you gain weight, and then it's harder. And obesity and getting bigger can also be really hard and stressful on your pelvic floor. So yeah, it's just trying to find something that you love. And again, sometimes that community environment is really helpful. So yeah.
I think that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Laurie. You answered so many amazing questions today, and I appreciate it so, so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. I trust you enjoyed today's episode featuring M. George and Laurie Forner on all things women's health. So, Em, if listeners want to find out more about the women's health services yourself or Laurie offer, where can they go?
For all of my details, you can check out www.pogophysio.com.au and check out the Women's Health tab. There's also a lot of blogs that you can check out there. Also, I'm on Instagram at physio_Emily. For Laurie, she is all over Twitter and Instagram. Check out her website, laurieforner.com.au, for all her info there.
If today was your first time tuning in to the Physical Performance Show, then a mighty welcome. If it was your 96th time, then a massive thank you for your ongoing support.
Lastly, if you did enjoy today's show, it would mean the absolute world to Laurie and I if you could leave a review on iTunes. Reviews help listeners just like you discover the information you heard today.
A big thank you this week to Burra, PDH, first-time listener who rated the show 5 stars. Brad, fantastic podcast. Like Clay, I'm a teacher, but an hour behind his time for the marathon. Striving for a PB, but having hit 50, finding that a challenge. Thanks to Clay for the training tips. Off to the track this week for some 400s, Phil Lucas. Phil, thank you very much for taking the time to leave a review. And I'm so pleased that the show is helping people just like yourself, Phil, pursue and enjoy the journey of discovering your physical best. And it's absolutely not just about elite performance or performers. It's about all of us. We're all on a journey to get the best out of ourselves. So, Phil, thank you very much for taking the time to leave that review. A big thank you to the team who make the Physical Performance Show possible. Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Olding on all things graphic design, and Daryl Misson, our audio engineer extraordinaire, on all things audio. Massive thanks once again to today's sponsors of the show, Normatec Recovery. Podcasts are certainly free to download, but they're not free to produce. So Normatec, your support is incredibly helpful. Thank you. Lastly, if you're into running, you can now pick up your copy of my running and jogging bestseller, You Can Run Pain-Free, over on Audible or iBooks. You Can Run Pain-Free is also available in Kindle or paperback versions from Amazon internationally or pogophysio.com.au or Amazon, of course, inside Australia. To say thank you for tuning into the Physical Performance Show, you can head over to pogophysio.com.au and pick up your copy for 50% off the recommended retail price. Simply add the promo code, one word, POD, P-O-D, 2018 in lowercase to receive your 50% off copy. Coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, episode 97, I recently caught up with Ben St. Lawrence. We're returning to the running theme. Ben St. Lawrence, dual Australian Olympian, who has still to this day the 10,000 metre record of 27:24, phenomenal, set back in 2011 ahead of the 2012 London Olympic Games. Ben's got a story and a half. On next week's episode, Ben takes us through from being relatively overweight at university into the binge drinking scene and the party scene through to pursuing his physical best and, of course, the highs, the lows and the many learnings on his journey to date. So that's Ben St. Lawrence next week on the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer and this has been the Physical Performance Show.